What is up, my fellow comic book fans? Mike from Comic Book Fans here. And today, we are doing a Spider-Man movie ranking. This was actually requested by one of my old admins from my IG page, or my Instagram page. I think honestly he was my first one, I think. But yeah, he's since moved on. But yeah, he requested this like 2 months ago. So sorry it took me so long, but hope I don't disappoint you, Jamal. Yeah, so just disclaimer here. So I do not care for the Amazing Spider-Man movies, and I have several reasons for that, but that isn't going to take up the whole video. But if you are a big fan of Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man and the Amazing Spider-Man movies, you will definitely highly disagree with where I put them on this list. So just to forewarn you, and honestly, this whole list is like everything nowadays, is controversial. So be warned, I guess. Yeah, so starting off, also I wanted to say about Into the Spider-Verse. I'm only including the live action movies in my official ranking, just because I guess there are a couple reasons why. But number one, when it comes to animated movies, like, they're great, but it's hard for me to see them on the same level as live action movies, mainly because it's just so different the way they're made and produced. You know, obviously with animated movies, they make the animation, they record all the voice lines, everything's very different, whereas in live action movies, they film it, they do this, they do that, they film some, voiceovers, they do the special effects. It's a very different process, and the end product's very different as well. And also, I feel like it's similar to like the Marvel and DC, well, mostly DC movies. Like, if you're gonna do DC movie ranking, you're gonna do the live action ones. Whereas with, if you wanted to, you could include all of the animated movies, but they're just so freaking many of them. And also, it's just very different. It's just sort of a different category for me between animation and live action. So, but if I had to choose, I guess I would put Into the Spider-Verse between Spider-Man 3 and Homecoming, but that's not going to mean much to you yet. So I guess just starting off, we're going to start at the bottom of the list with number 7, which is The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Yeah, so I think we can kind of objectively say this was the worst Spider-Man movie. Oh no, what? Yeah, so I know a lot of people are going to say, no, it's Spider-Man 3, but I'll get to that. But I'm not going to give like a whole review for each movie. I'm just going to give like, a few sentences about each. But The Amazing Spider-Man 2, say what you will about Andrew Garfield's portrayal, which I'll get to in the next thing, but there's just so much bad about this movie. It's hard to, the villains were awful and horribly one-dimensional. The way they made Peter Parker act was like kind of a self-absorbed D-bag most of the movie, honestly, like to the point where he goes to a graduation and like makes out with his girlfriend in front of everybody, like drawing all the attention to him. And then when his old best friend asks for his help, he's like, oh no, it's too dangerous, like I can't give you my blood. It's like, you really think he would just inject the blood, his blood into his own bloodstream without taking it to a lab and analyzing it, whatever? It's just, the whole thing didn't make any sense. It made Peter look like a jerk, and the whole story, the whole narrative, it didn't make sense. And then the whole thing with Electro was weird. He was a really weird character, like, didn't seem like a normal human being. He seemed like some weird, like, animated, like, cartoon character. It was weird. There's everything about that, and then, the whole, like, don't you know, I'm Electro, that whole thing. And then the end battle was, like, especially the end battle between him and Electro wasn't terrible, I guess, but the end battle between Spider-Man and Green Goblin, which was Harry, which he looked like he was on meth or something. It was looked terrible.
I think we can still make your flight.
But yeah, the end fight was like so abbreviated and weird. The best thing about that movie for me was Gwen dying, and
fatality.
Not because I hate Gwen necessarily, but it's because that was like the only part of the movie where I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, this is a Spider-Man movie, this is from the comics, I don't know. All right, I'm done hating on this movie, but I gotta say there were just so many crappy things about this movie, and the way he's quit being Spider-Man for like 5 minutes and then came back. There was like no build-up, no climax. It just like seemed really rushed and forced. And then the way they were like whole last half of the movie, they were almost setting up the Sinister Six movie, which would have been cool if it actually happened, I guess. But anyway, yeah. So that's why this movie is at the bottom. Not to mention there were a ton of scenes that were so terrible. The dialogue was so terribly written. Huh. I will say, the one thing I have to say about The Amazing Spider-Man 2 that I did like, I think it really captured the spirit of Spider-Man that I felt was missing in the first movie. The first movie was really dark, and this movie really captured the whole more lighthearted tone of Spider-Man, which isn't always the case, but is often the case. And yeah, so speaking of the first movie, The Amazing Spider-Man 1 is number 6. And again, I'm not going to get too into everything I dislike about these movies. That isn't what this video is about. But I will say, Andrew Garfield's portrayal, sorry, actually not sorry. If you like his portrayal, fine, good for you. But he's just not Spider-Man to me. My background, I grew up, to be fair, the first Spider-Man, my first introduction to Spider-Man was the first Raimi film, but that was when I was like really, really young. Since then, I collected comics since I was 6, and almost all of them were Spider-Man comics. I've been reading his comics from like the 60s, like the old comics from the 60s, and the modern ones. I've watched like almost all the cartoons of Spider-Man, so I've like pretty much saturated myself a lot with Spider-Man. And Garfield's portrayal was just the one version that just did not work for me. It was partially the way he was written, the way he was like basically wasn't even he was an outsider. Like I heard one YouTuber say he's an outsider. He's not an outcast. Like Peter Parker was always bullied for who he was, whereas in The Amazing Spider-Man he was only bullied because he stood up for somebody else. Like Peter would never have had the confidence to do that before he became Spider-Man. But they basically made Peter like a very confident, brash dude. He wasn't even that intelligent. At least they made it seem like he was, but then when it really came down to it, he didn't really demonstrate a whole lot of intelligence except when he like created his web shooters and stuff. But like, yeah, so it just he was already a very kind of popular, very confident character, and he basically wasn't special, and by that I mean he basically acted like every other high schooler in 2012. You know, he didn't stand out at all really. So it just wasn't Peter Parker. And then there was the way the way Garfield played him. There was some really weird lines and some weird things. It was like he was trying to be comedic, but it just came off as weird and kind of cringy. So that's like one of my main beefs with this movie. But there are a lot of narrative things that didn't work. Like a lot of things they basically just tried to remake the Raimi movie, but updated. And they tried to do a lot of the same things that just did not work. Like they basically tried to recreate that scene with the New Yorkers helping Spider-Man. With on the bridge in the first Spider-Man film, the first Raimi Spider-Man film, and they basically try to do that with the whole crane thing. But it just didn't work. It just fell flat. It didn't really give the sense of like, whoa, this is really cool that you got in the first Raimi film. So, and there are many reasons for that, but I'm not going to go into that. But it was mainly the way that everything was written. But yeah, so that's basically why it's that number 6. Well, though I will say, it did look nice. Like the special effects and the way they made Spider-Man's suit look, all that stuff looked very cool. But other than that, and let's be honest, Peter was kind of a dick for most of the movie. Like, the cops show up and he's just like, I just did 80% of your job. Like,
Freeze! He's not
You and the
going
tights
anywhere.
don't move!
You serious?
Who are you?
No one seems to grasp the concept of the mask.
Freeze!
I just did 80% of your job. Huh? That's how you repay me?
it's just not stuff that... He didn't have the quips that Spider-Man had. It was very much just, like, arrogant, sarcastic crap. It was... Anyway, I'm done with those movies. Moving on, so number 5 is gonna have to be Spider-Man 3 for obvious reasons. We all know like why this wasn't the best movie. Sam Raimi wanted to go a direction, Sony made him go a different direction, but I think Sandman was written pretty well. The way they all made him, you know, Peter's Uncle Ben's killer. That worked pretty well, but then everything else, like with Venom was very forced. I think everything up until Venom, going to Eddie Brock, besides the dancing. Yeah, it was just really forced, and they didn't. Eddie Brock wasn't well cast. The way they made Venom, like, it was a symbiote, but it didn't have its own personality like it does in the comics. Just all those things. There's a lot of problems with it, but there were a lot of good things too. Like, I think that some of the action set pieces were so good. Like the first battle between New Goblin and Peter was really cool. Even the end battle really gave me like a swell of like, ooh, this is really cool. When Peter showed up to save Mary Jane, but then when Harry came to back him up too, that was cool too. But there was definitely problems with this movie, which we all know. But that's why it's number 5. But I still do enjoy that movie. Number 4, and now these next two are gonna be a little bit more like controversial, and they're even hard for me to choose because they're almost on the same level. But the next one is gonna be Spiderman Homecoming. Now, don't get me wrong, this movie is really, really, really good. It's one of my favorite Spider-Man movies. But the reason it doesn't go higher on this list is for a few reasons, I guess. One of the reasons is because half the movie he's basically just sort of trying to prove to Tony that, he's a good hero in his own right, which works in the narrative, works in the whole overarching story of the MCU. But as for a Spider-Man film, it's a little bit more of a step back when we've seen so many movies where Peter was already on his own, like doing everything by himself. So that's one of the reasons. Also, there was just something about this movie that's really like mini scale, which I think was the point. It's supposed to be like friendly neighborhood Spider-Man type stuff, but I just feel like they could have done a little bit more to make it a little bit more spectacular or something. And that's like a little bit what was missing. But I gotta say, the humor was really, really good. I really loved most of the humor.
Chill.
Come on!
What happened to your voice?
What do you mean, what happened to my voice?
I heard you by the bridge. I know what a girl sound like.
I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. I mean, I'm a man.
I don't care what you are, boy, girl.
I'm not a girl, I'm a man.
And I think that was mostly due to the writers. And I will say the action was pretty good. That's one of the things that I mean by what wasn't spectacular, is the action was a little lacking. Like, there were definitely some cool parts to it, and I think Tom Holland nailed the character well, and I even liked the addition of Ned Leeds. But I just think, and the whole thing with Liz Allen, which was technically Liz Toombs, was like, it worked in the story. It was good. It just felt kind of weird, like an odd deviation from the comics. But again, that's kind of nitpicking. But that's why it's number 4. Now, number 3, this is gonna piss some people off. Oh well. Number 3, Far From Home. Now, the reason I rank this higher than Homecoming, I will say the humor in Far From Home is kind of lame. I'll be honest with you. Some of it's funny as heck, and some of it you could tell they got different writers, because some of the humor is like, really? Like that one part where Peter is like changing his clothes into the new Spider-Man suit in front of that girl, and then that dude walks in, Henry or something, I forget his name. He walks in and sees Peter and thinks he hired a prostitute. It's like, that was weird and unnecessary. Just things like that, and that whole scene with where Peter's stopping that drone from like killing that kid. It's like, all right, it was okay. Like, it wasn't the worst thing I've ever seen in a movie, but it was just a little weird deviation, I guess. Wasn't necessary. I think they were trying to go for, trying to show Peter balancing his life and all that stuff, which, okay. But it was a little weird. There were things like that. But I think this movie made up for it with everything else, which this movie kind of built off of Homecoming, but in a better way, where he's basically he's struggling with, basically being the replacement Iron Man, and not, being a copy of Iron Man, but basically picking up the mantle and being his own hero, not just his own hero, which he's already been, but also being everybody else's hero. Like, he's basically like the go-to Avenger for right now. and he's like 17. He's struggling with that. He just wants a break, and that's the whole point of the movie. It's almost the sort of the whole great power, great responsibility thing, where he's got this responsibility, but he just wants to be a normal kid, but he can't because he is who he is. He's Spider-Man. He needs to pick up the reins and be the Spider-Man everybody needs him to be the hero everyone needs him to be. And I really liked that overarching arc with his story, and it ended up ending with him making his own suit. Like, sure, it was with Tony Stark's tech, but it's like, yeah, he's a poor high school kid. Where's he gonna get his tech? Of course, I didn't have a problem with that, but it was cool to see him make his own suit, and I love that suit, by the way. And I think overall, just the action and special effects were a lot cooler, more spectacular. I really liked Mysterio as a villain. I think they did him very well, and Jake Gyllenhaal was a great choice. That whole storyline where I kind of knew it was going to go there, I think they executed it well, and I think it was true to the Mysterio character in the comics. Yada yada yada. So yeah, that's why I like this movie. That's why it's a little bit above Homecoming. And don't get me wrong, I really love Homecoming too. It's like really close. It's hard, but yeah. A lot of people seem to not like Far From Home because of some of the dumb humor, but I think everything else made up for that. But yeah, also I think in Far From Home, I think the romance was done better. I think it felt a lot more like an awkward teen romance. Like, I kind of felt like I had seen that when I was in high school. So I think they did a really good job writing that kind of stuff. Now, the last two, again, these were like neck and neck, so hard for me to do, but number 2 is going to have to be Sam Raimi's original movie, Spider-Man. Now, this is the movie that introduced me to Spider-Man, so it does hold a special place in my heart. So I almost made this number 1. And I will say it's very well done, a little dated, but the special effects do still kind of hold up. But I think the main thing that makes this movie so good is just the journey of Spider-Man. Like, he started out, and not to mention it's very true to the spirit of the Spider-Man comics and the characters. So, Spider-Man starts out as a nerdy kid, awkward, nobody really likes him too much except for Harry. He's like, the people he's closest to are his aunt and uncle and Harry. And he is an outcast because of who he is, basically, not because of anything he's really done, just his personality, who he is. People just think he's a nerd, he's a geek, and he's a loser, and people prey on those kind of people. So that was very realistic, and I think even very relatable to a lot of people who saw the movie. But I think his overarching story arc between being that shy outcast to a hero, a confident hero who everybody loves, besides J. Jonah Jameson.
You serious?
Definitely really good. I think it was a really good introduction to the character to like general audiences, and also I think it was just really well written to be like from the beginning, like he starts out as like this outcast, this nerd who nobody likes, like I said, and then we get to the bridge scene, which I mentioned earlier, where all of New York is like has his back, and he knows that he's not alone. I think that was a very big arc for him, going from having almost nobody to having being beloved, and just who he was as a character. Like, Spider-Man Peter Parker always does the right thing, and that's what he did. Like, in the movie, like, obviously there was that one scene with Uncle Ben, but that's from the comics. That was like where he kind of realized, with great power comes great responsibility, and he always does the right thing. Like, in this film, he puts himself in danger multiple times to save even just one person, and even to the point where Green Goblin can exploit that. And speaking of Green Goblin, Willem Dafoe is so good. Like, sure, his helmet's a little bit cheesy, all that, but Willem Dafoe played he went all in with that character. He went all in. He played it so well, even to the point where like his stance is like he's like squatting, like Green Goblin always did in the comics on his glider, just stuff like that. Like, he went all in, and like you may call it a little hammy, but I think it works well for the character. He's supposed to be an insane psycho, and I think it was really good. So that's why I love that movie. Now, number 1. I wonder what that could be. Yeah, Spider-Man 2. Now, this a little cliche. A lot of people say this is the best Spider-Man film, but I kind of gotta agree. It kind of builds off of the themes from the first movie, where Peter is, just kind of adjusting to being, a big superhero, but also it introduces a new theme where he is the hero. He's got what he wanted. He's not the outcast anymore, but now he realizes that means he can't have the things he wants, like the girl of his dreams, or doing well in school, things like that. He realizes he can't live a normal life, and then eventually that makes him give up his powers